are demanding it, but how do you define deforestation? Dr. Steve Wiedemann, an agricultural systems scientist, is here with more. Steve, just how divisive of an issue is this?
Oh, look, no doubt this is a hot button topic for producers, and there's big things at play in how this plays out. You might say it's a simple question. What is deforestation? That's like the money question for 2024 to resolve, and there's big passions on both sides of the discussion.
So how do you define it?
Yeah, there's
a big long sigh before that one.
Well, I mentioned it's a year long, I think. It's going to take to unpack that, and Cattle Australia are actually, right as we speak, presenting the first framework, if you like, to unpack. The reason why it's complex is you've got to work through a whole range of issues to get an answer. There's a very simplistic answer. You take a forest, you clear it, it's deforestation. That's not really adequate because in most of our management practices, we need to control a certain amount of regrowth. So if I was going to touch on, I know we've only got a couple of minutes, but I was going to touch on a few things. What we end up with is we have some things that are probably reasonably clear and some things that are definitely grey. Of the reasonably clear, you'd say taking down remnant or primary forest, that's pretty clearly deforestation. Where the grey emerges is how we handle that regrowth control, really. And obviously it's a practice that if you're maintaining pastures, you're here to produce beef, you might have been in that cycle for decades or generations, and it's just part of what you do. We've got to be able to produce high quality food for the world as well, and we've got to be able to manage as well customers, banks, other institutions who have an expectation that we manage the land and we do it well, and of course that's the priority.
That's what it comes down to though, isn't it? Expectations on land management.
Yeah, at the end of the day, and there's no doubt that for the average consumer, their biggest touch on the environment is actually through the food that they consume. I was just looking at some of the numbers this morning, and you might have a person who lives on a 500 square metre house block in suburbia, but their annual beef consumption touches anything up to 50 times that much land through the production land. Now the way it interacts, obviously the vast majority of that's managed entirely sustainably. We're doing the right thing, we can do that for generations. It's just that there's an interest, a growing interest right through that whole supply chain. Customer side, the finance side, saying we're interested. And so it's a new thing. That's an evolution to be looking back down the supply chain that way and taking a genuine interest.
Particularly with the EU banning the sale of imported goods from recently deforested land. In terms of, I guess, their rules, and then we've got Cattle Australia trying to put forward our own framework that's globally accepted. How much do things vary across the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, from the starting point, we don't have the same view entirely on what a forest is. So under that EU framework, a forest is 10% canopy cover, trees 5 metres of height. In Australia, we tend to say trees of 2 metres height and 20% canopy cover. So we don't even agree on what a forest is as a starting point. And I guess that just goes to the heart of why we need to look at it as a local issue and properly understand it in our context.
Have you seen Cattle Australia's framework they're putting out today?
I've had just a quick glance at it before the official announcement, but it'll be out for all to see, I think from right after their meet today.
What do you think it should include to be globally accepted, right?
Yeah, well, I touched on what I think are some of the fairly clear-cut issues. Everything written internationally highlights a natural forest, what's called a natural forest. It reasonably well aligns to a remnant or a primary forest, an area of forest that's never been cleared. I think it's, for the vast majority of states and the vast majority of farmer practice in Australia, there's no clearing of that sort of country in Australia anymore. That was quite a while in the past, so I don't think that's too controversial, really. As I mentioned, we've got to work out the grey around routine regrowth control. And then we also need to work out how to practically manage our farms, because I said before, the simplistic definition, if it's a forest, you take it down, that's deforestation. Well, that'd actually cover prickly acacia too. So we're going to restrict people from doing woody weed control? Clearly not. There's a range of logical and necessary exclusions that have to happen, and you've got to put a reasonable amount of detail around that, just so that you don't end up with this one-size-fits-all type top-down approach. I think that's important. They're the kind of things that really need to be worked through.
Steve, thanks very much for your time.
Very good. Thank you.
Well, let's take a look back at an inside